This is the story of leptin and why it is so misunderstood. Leptin is a hormone that's produced by fat cells. It signals the brain that there's plenty of energy in the fat cells. When you have enough energy in your fat storage, leptin tells your brain, and your brain responds by saying, "Good, I'm full. I don't need any more food." Think of it as a gas gauge communicating with your brain. So say you go for a big run and you get lost in the forest and you don't eat for 12 hours while you're trying to find your way home. Then you use some of the energy in your fat cells. This is when the leptin signal gets weak. When the leptin signal gets weak, the brain responds by saying, "Oh boy, fat cells are depleted, I better send out the hunger signal." So when fat stores are maintained, leptin helps prevent us from overeating. But sometimes leptin doesn't function properly. The leptin signal is there, but it doesn't get to the brain, and so the brain continues to send out the hunger signal. This is called leptin resistance. What researchers have discovered is that too much insulin in the blood and too much sugar in the blood can cause leptin resistance, meaning that leptin doesn't get to the brain to tell the brain not to send out the hunger signal, even though leptin is there and the fat storage is met. Now, the practical advice to solve this is to get insulin levels down and get blood sugar levels down in order to get the leptin signals to the brain once again, allowing leptin to function normally. Now, getting blood sugars down can be done by avoiding refined and highly processed carbohydrates and sugars. That's not too hard. But getting insulin levels down is a little more tricky because just about everyone gets this wrong. And actually, the reason why folks have trouble recovering from leptin resistance is the same reason why people tend to manage their diabetes instead of recovering from it. Typically, the advice is to get insulin levels down by going low carb, high protein. Those with too much insulin in the blood are typically instructed not to eat grains or high carbohydrate diets. Rather, they're encouraged to eat grass-fed and wild meats and basically follow a high protein, low carb diet. Here's the thing. Since the 1920s, nutrition researchers have known that fat causes the greatest insulin resistance and the most severe insulin spikes, even more than pure white table sugar and white refined flour. On our cells is a spot for insulin to attach, called an insulin receptor, right here. Imagine it's like a lock. Insulin comes along and behaves like a key, fits into the lock, the insulin receptor, and this allows the gate to open so sugar can get into the cell, here. In diabetes, the lock or the insulin receptor gets gummed up with fat, predominantly animal fat, and the key or the insulin can't get into the lock, so the gate that allows the sugar into the cell doesn't open. So there's a bunch of insulin in the blood, but it can't get into the insulin receptors on the cells, and therefore sugar can't get into the cells. So there's excess sugar in the blood as well as excess insulin in the blood. This is insulin resistance, and insulin resistance can cause leptin resistance. Going high protein, low carb never cures diabetes because the insulin receptor, or lock, on the cell continues to remain blocked or gummed up with fat, and the key, which is the insulin, can never get in. The high protein diet never does the trick because flesh is made up of cells that have a phospholipid bilayer, meaning the cell walls are made in part of fat. So even the leanest cuts of meat are still 30% fat. But a clean, low-fat, plant-based diet helps decrease the fat and the insulin receptor clears. Once we decrease insulin resistance, automatically we decrease leptin resistance. Leptin gets to our brain to say we are full. To do this, we need to eat more plants and replace meat and animal products with starch and other complex carbohydrates that are low in fat.